Welcome, Willie, and thank you for taking the time to take part in this short conversation about the history of BAPO. I'll hand over to you just to give an introduction of who you are first before we start with the questions.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Yes, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. I'm William Munro, son of another William Munro, who was an orthotist back in the 60s until the 80s. Um, Over my career, I worked as part of the family business, worked with Tailors of Walsall in the late 80s, early 90s, and then formed Munro Bolton Orthotics. That sat alongside the family business of W. Munro Rehab and subsequently Anatomical Concepts. I basically worked across all facets of orthotics, but latterly, well, for the last 20 odd years, I specialised in limb salvage and diabetic foot problems, was a member of the Scottish Diabetes Foot Action Group, and I was a clinical examiner at the University of Strathclyde and a placement supervisor as well. So I had a fair amount of experience in the UK. I also had a partnership in the United States and worked with Clavinus Academy and the Neuhoffs Academy in Germany, primarily in diabetes. Also did a research project with Martin Buchan, a knee surgeon in Inverclyde, looking at offloading knees that were not fit for surgery, either due to obesity or other medical complications. So had a fairly wide career in terms of orthotics. In terms of professional body, I was a member of BIST when I qualified in 1981 and subsequently became a member of APO in the latter part of the 1980s. Moving on from being the first chair of BAPO, I was vice chair of the Orthotists Board of the Council for Preparation Supplementary to Medicine, and was then asked to join the Shadow Health Profession Council in 1999, and subsequently served for the next 10 years on the Health Professions Council in terms of regulation. So I think that's a very short bio of the life and times of Munro.
A short bio, but a very rich and varied career. So you were the first chair of the British Association of Prosthetists and Orthotists, now called the British Association of Prosthetics and Orthotics. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means to you?
I think it was the pinnacle of many of my generation's aspirations, from first, being involved and understanding what prosthetics and orthotics was about. But moreover, it was a realization of the skills that we had, both artisan and also academic by that stage, and that what we were looking for was parity with other allied health professions who valued the work that we did, but were maybe sometimes astounded the fact that we weren't regulated. So the formation of BAPO was the entry point for us getting eventually recognition as a regulated professional body or profession.
Oh, is it a proud moment for you to be the first chair of BAPO?
Well, it was very humbling, to be honest. I suppose I've never really looked upon pride as being something, and I don't mean that in a flippant sense. I think the situation was that I was part of a goodly number of individuals whose heart, whose passion for the job that they did, whether it be in prosthetics and or orthotics, was paramount. And it was all really about ensuring that we got the best possible deal for the profession in terms of recognition of the skills that we had been trained in, both, as I say, in the artisan, or the craft side of things, but more importantly, the maturity of the academic standing that we were starting to deliver.
Mm-hmm. And many of our members might not be familiar with BAPO's history. Before we became the British Association of Prosthetists and Orthotists, we were part of something called the British Institute of Surgical Technologies. Can you tell us a little bit about the British Institute of Surgical Technologies, Willie?
I think BIST, as it was known, British Institute of Surgical Technologists, had four sections. They had the orthotic section, prosthetic section, surgical, and dental. And probably in terms of the publication of a journal, the dental section was the most prolific, followed by the odd orthotic and or prosthetic. So essentially, I think certainly by the beginning of the 80s, BIST had been around for about 75 years. Um, and as I say, with that, effectively, that was if the civil service, if the government wished to have discussions about orthotic, prosthetic, dental, or surgical practice, bearing in mind that our titles were orthopedic and surgical appliances or technologists. The situation was that they had the BIST to go to for views on practice or anything in terms of the professional side of things. So it was, if you like, it was the baseline. It did have a national orthotic committee that used to meet in Stourbridge and near Birmingham. And there was elections to go on to that. I think, without sounding parochially Scots, my father actually was on that committee, but was there as an observer rather than, a full legitimate member in the sense of the exercise of elections or anything like that. I think there was a prosthetic section as well, but I think historically the prosthetic section wasn't just as active as the orthotic one.
Right, I see. So what role did the British Surgical Trades Association play when
So,
prosthetists and orthotists were a member of BIST?
well, I think that this is where sometimes the ground was a challenge, or the background, should I say, was a challenge, because the Secretariat for the British Institute of Surgical Technologists and the British Surgical Trades Association was within the one house. That the secretary at the time was secretary of both of these organisations. And essentially, the British Surgical Trades Association was the trades body. So essentially, the clarity between what were purely professional issues and what were commercial or trades issues at times could be miscued because of the fact that some of the individuals that represented the British Surgical Trades Association were also representatives of the British Institute of Surgical Technologists. And so going forward, this was seen not only by some of the members of the British Institute, but also those within the civil service as being a conflict of interest. Now, this is a bit controversial, but looking back on it, if it were to happen today, it just would not be allowed because the proximity between the two bodies was not in the best interest, really, of the professionals, as in the prosthetists and orthotists.
I see. So were our technicians part of the association at this time?
Technicians weren't part of the association in the early days. However, I think most practitioners in both orthotics and prosthetics recognised that in terms of their clinical skills, the end job was only as good as the technicians that they worked with. And that I think going forward, there was never a situation, certainly in my belief, and certainly in my practice, that we would reckon the technicians not to be recognised. But I think the challenge at the time, and we're looking sort of late 80s into the early 90s, what we had to do was we had to establish a baseline for those that were working in clinical practice. And having done that, it was then an escalator to bring the technicians on board at some time that was suitable to allow that to happen.
So how did people qualify as a prosthetist and orthotist whilst we were a member of BIST?
In the early days of BIST, essentially you had to be taken on by a reputable outfit, whether that be an NHS or, for the most part, it was within the commercial sphere. And with that, there was a recommendation that you had to serve a period of 7 years before you could apply for a licentiateship of the British Institute, which was, if you like, the baseline order. And with that, the signing off had to be taken or be approved by a medical practitioner that had worked closely with the individual during the period of training, and that knew of them. So once you had reached the level of licentiateship, there was the possibility, after experience and after a degree of peer recognition, that you could move forward to becoming a fellow of the British Institute of Surgical Technologists, BIST.
So it's quite a lengthy period of training and experience that you needed at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So we later became the Association of Prosthetists and Orthotists, APO. How did this association come about, and what was the reason it was formed?
Well, I think the situation was that BIST were still in place, and Association of Prosthetists and Orthotists was essentially um, inaugurated by those who had studied at the National Centre at Strathclyde. And the challenging thing at the time was the optic. My generation were going through the diplomas at either Paddington or Salford, and in 1972 the course at Strathclyde started. And I think politically, with a small p, as we all started to mature, we started to grow apart from the BIST, BSTA type of situation, and wanted to be recognised for the professionals and the educational standard that we were attaining. And in the first instance, APO, some of the graduates, so Susie Shaw, as she was, Susie Gordon now, Bill Spence, Bill Dykes, Robert Gregg, to name but a few, were ones that decided to go down, if you like, a kind of more academic line, and as such, put some clear water between professional issues, educational issues, and what was perceived as this challenge between BIST and BSTA being the one and same voice. And so APO was formed in the mid 80s. In fact, I think I tried to look back. I think it was probably 83, 84. My recognition was I wasn't long married, and it was round about the same time. So that's where I get the time from. And essentially, the APO conference went from being a relatively small affair to being something that people across the UK wanted to be involved with, because for the first time, I think it was factual and it was academic as well as being practical. And so the momentum started to build through APO and bring people across from BIST. So many people actually would be members of BIST, but would also be members of APO. And that narrowing of the gap, across the UK, led by the example of those early people from Strathclyde, really was the catalyst for driving us forward, as a profession.
So at that time then, what was the role of the Council to Professions Supplementary to Medicine? What role did they play?
The Council for Professions Supplementary to Medicine were the regulator, but even at that stage, even at the stage in the early 90s, it was deemed that because of the way practice was being evolved in both physiotherapy, podiatry, speech and language therapy, radiography, that it was coming to the end of its usefulness, but it was the step forward to a change. And for us, it was really important before that change took place that we, as prosthetists and orthotists, became registered. As in those days, it was called state registration. And state registration came with it to a broad expanse in the same way that the Healthcare Professions Council, or HPC as it was when it was first formed, was about. It was a more modern, it was more tuned to the change in practice, clinical practice, ethics, and all that was there. So CPSM regulated the other allied health professions that we aspired to be sitting alongside with.
So this year is BAPO's 30th year anniversary, which means we were formed in 1995. Can you tell us why BAPO was formed, coming out of APO, and who was involved in forming it?
Well, in terms, as I said, that there was this, if you like, expansion of belief that came from, well, was initiated by APO that brought BIST members on board, and there was discussions that took place at a number of levels, both at academic level as well as on the professional side of things, about how could we attain this state registration. So as a consequence of that, and bear in mind that this time there was no devolved parliaments, it was Westminster that we had to deal with, the civil service in the Department of Health had said that to gain regulation, state regulation through Council for Professional Supplementary to Medicine, what we had to do was we had to come together to form one professional body. And they weren't willing to have discussions on two planes. They wanted it on the one plane. And so what then happened, given the momentum of BIST members wanting to join APO, it seemed that what we had almost was a fusion of the profession, but without a professional name. And so we started to have, as APO and BIST orthotic and prosthetic sections, discussions about how we could take things forward, how we could become a single professional body, what our aims, what our constitution was. And as a consequence of that, there were people who represented the National Prosthetic Committee, Kevin Harney being one of them, and the likes of Paul Keeping, Andy Chase, Colin Peacock from the National Orthotic Committee. There was myself and Richard Hylands, because at that stage Richard was chair of APO and I was the deputy. But Bill Dykes was involved in the discussions, and I believe Bill Spence to a certain extent at one stage as well. So all of us spent many weekends, because we decided that the centre point of the UK was going to be Manchester. So we drove down every Saturday morning and met either in Manchester or sometimes in Stoke as well, and basically worked out. And I can't say necessarily in the first instance it was easy, although we all got on and we all believed that we wanted to get where it was. So it was, dare I say, good humoured. But part of the BIST thing was that they wanted to maintain the secretariat that's shared with BSTA. And one of the red lines for APO was that, no, we had to establish a new secretariat that was totally independent, that we could still have discussions with BSTA and be part of the forum, but APO and BIST had to form BAPO and become a self-sufficient organisation with our own secretariat. And after, I think probably a good year and a half, we managed to negotiate and get essentially a settlement that arrived at the first BAPO, which allowed people from with an interest, with a passion and an enthusiasm for what we did as a profession, to be the driver. And that was, if you like, the main focal point of where it went. And we were very fortunate that we were able to form a secretariat where we had Hilda Thomas, who had previously been Professor Hughes' secretary at the National Centre, who had a massive wealth of background knowledge of prosthetics and orthotics and rehabilitation. And Hilda became our first secretary, and that formed the birth of BAPO, as it was.
There's a lot of work that went into forming BAPO, from the group of people that you've just mentioned. What difference do you think it made to the profession, Willie, when BAPO was formed?
Without exaggerating this, I think it was massive. There was a coming together, and dare I say, a joy in the fact that for once we felt that we had some powers, maybe the wrong word to use, but we had influence now. We had a situation where we could show we were united. We had agreement on the principles of the professional body and how that stood aside from either the commercial side of things or even those that were working in the NHS. It was purely focused on what those who were practicing prosthetics and orthotics could do, what they were capable of, and what they aspired to. And I think from the wind up AGM and meeting of BIST to the APO one, I think that both of these were very well attended. Everybody had, maybe wrong to call it euphoria, but there was certainly, there was a real feeling of well-being that the profession has taken control of itself now, and we could move forward with the aspirations that we had.
Mhm. With a real identity and a voice for advocacy. Because I've been doing a little bit of reviewing of BAPO's history myself, and I was looking at some of the AGM reports from 1999, 2000, and it was great to see how many members BAPO had in those early days. Almost all UK prosthetists and orthotists were members of BAPO in those days. What difference did it make to have such a big number base in the profession when you were chair? And why do you think, or what are some of the factors of maybe why those numbers have reduced quite drastically over the last 20 years?
I think that there's several. It's a bit like an onion. There's several skins on it. I think in the first instance, as I say, the fact that there was belief that we had, our destiny in our own hands. I
Mhm.
think also that going forward, there was support from the commercial employers, because they saw this as a way of enriching not only the people that they employed, but also the profile of what the business was about. Um, I think the other kind of technical part of it, many people felt that they should be involved in this because going forward, if they were seen to be fit to be members of BAPO, because that there were criteria that were set out that that gave you the membership of BAPO, that when state registration took place, that what would happen is that there would be less likelihood for the grandfathering side of things to take place, and that as a recognised member of BAPO, you would basically fit into and be given a state registration. Because the membership criteria that was set out to be a full member of BAPO was there and was set up in such a way that should we move forward, and as we did move forward, that membership of BAPO was in a sense a license to practice, because membership of BIST before that, British Institute of Surgical Technology, that was in a sense a license to practice, albeit not a statutory license to practice. So there were all these factors that were going on. But as I say, come back to it from a many personal point of view, there was a union of thought, there was a union of purpose, there was a friendship that was building across the UK that maybe had been not split as such, but it gave people an opportunity to go into other spheres and learn more and be involved a bit more. And so that, I think, or these reasons were the primary factor that we had the membership that we had. But moreover that, the first few conferences that we had well over, I think, probably up to about 1,500 people that attended, because it was one of the best bashes of the year. It was, the like one of the big concerts of the year. Everybody met up. There was the conference in itself had support from the trade, but more importantly, the quality of the papers that were starting to be given had moved a bit from being artisan to being more academic.
Mhm.
Um, and I wouldn't even start to say it was Glastonbury, but it was BAPO's version of Glastonbury, for several years in terms of the way that it went on.
So what would your message be to prosthetists, orthotists, technicians, support workers, and our learners about the importance of being a member of their professional body?
I think going back slightly to one of the questions, the previous questions, I think some of the fall off was due to a number of decisions that took place probably in and across 2000s, one of which was union membership. Because I think in the early days, because of the support that was there from most of the employers, many people had the BAPO membership paid for. And so there was, if you like, a skeleton of support that was behind the individual. But when some of the decisions were taken, particularly about the union side of things, then what we had was either individuals for their own, um, ways of thinking, and that decided that they didn't want to be. And certainly, I think my feeling, although it's a challenge for me because within the environment that I was, it wasn't so much of an issue. But I think amongst some of the bigger companies, that there was certainly a bit of a challenge in terms of, how do we work this, this support, when unionism came in. I think the other thing is that many of us, when we first qualified, well, I first qualified in 81, in some of the hospitals that I covered, I mean, we basically were in a cubicle, or we were in something that was no more than a broom cupboard.
Mm.
And so we had to fight. One of the aims of having the strength that BAPO was that we could go back and say, right, we should be registered, because essentially in some areas, the working conditions that we've got are substandard for us to deliver what we are capable of. And over and above that, the situation is that the empowerment to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for the patients. Can you imagine having to go in and be measured for like a fabric support in those days, and you were in something that was no bigger than a toilet cubicle? That wasn't acceptable. So, there was a real fight amongst all of us, both in prosthetics and orthotics, although I think prosthetics were a bit better off than some of the orthotic side of things, to make this better. And that contributed again to the fact that we had the numbers. Once we had been able to attain the registration, once we'd been able to get forward into the Health Professions Council, which was even better in terms of the support structure, and the recognition, then workplace facilities, and the fact that we were tied correctly to a set of principles and ways of working, that forced places that we worked to conform to what we were asking. It then became, and I don't want to sound disingenuous here, but it just became recognised that that was the norm.
Mhm.
And when you have to fight for something, then the strength of numbers is important. When you don't really need to fight for anything, you're in a situation, well, how does it It's just like the JFK bit, what can I do for my country, or what can my country do for me? It's a bit like that with BAPO. And so I think lines got blurred. The fact that people actually coming in, for the most part, were coming into something that was acceptable to them, and they didn't have to fight against that unacceptability. That kind of created this spiral that reduced some of the membership. But to answer the question directly, I think it is absolutely fundamentally important that the individuals who are practicing in prosthetics and orthotics support the professional body that is recognised by the devolved governments, by Westminster government, as the people who should be speaking for them. And if they don't engage with the professional body and they have something that they don't find acceptable, how's the professional body going to stand up for them if that two-way street and that communication is not there? And yes, there is the burden of many expenses now. However, I think if there wasn't BAPO and there wasn't a professional body to stand up for them, we would be spiralling back in many instances to the areas that we were in the late 70s, early 80s, where it was totally disjointed and there wasn't a positivity of direction.
And I think that's why this conversation is really important, because I think our members and those in our profession who are not members, I think it's really important that they understand that history. They understand where we've come from, and we've come a long way. There's still a way to go, and there's still things that we need to push forward for in terms of equity. And you're absolutely right. That's why we need those numbers to support us, so we can advocate on their behalf. Finally, Willie, it's our 30th anniversary, as we've said, and there's going to be a celebration and awards event on November the 21st. Are you going to be there?
Oh, yes. I have got my tartan trews already looked out and pressed.
Well, I look forward to it, Willie. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing all your experience and knowledge of BAPO.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Nikki.